All righty, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of February 2021. Today's speaker is Clare Pearson and her title is Time Made Manifest, Haunting and Possession in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Please note that this presentation is also being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School Student Community website on Canvas after the fact if you wish to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphone during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box afterwards. At any time, well, I say afterwards, but at any time during the presentation, when your question strikes your imagination, you can open the chat box by moving your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the chat button. That will open up the chat box. Questions that you type in there, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Clare at the end of the lecture during the question and answer period. Clare and I will be able to see your video, but won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it's entirely at your discretion. Clare's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the basic program of liberal education for adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the basic program and our upcoming events. The basic program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there is no substitute for detailed engagement with great ideas and texts. Through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago trained instructors. Due to the current crisis, all of our classes take place remotely. We have a few events coming up on February 10. Join us for a series of roundtable discussions featuring frontline physicians and healthcare experts from University of Chicago Medicine. Then, Thursday, February 18, please join us from 4 p.m. to 5:30 for an event we call Telling Tales Part 2, Stories from Basic Program Students. Also later this month, we continue our movie night series. On Friday, February 26, from 6 to 7:30 p.m., we will be discussing the film Black Panther. Watch the movie ahead of time and register ahead of time for the event as well. Also, later in February, we will resume offering our sample discussions to recruit folks into year 1 of the 4-year program. Tell your friends and family. Finally, on March 20, so a little bit further out, but on March 20, we will be holding a half-day symposium to mark the arrival of spring break. That's the way we celebrate. Professor James Redfield of the University of Chicago Committee on Social Thought will deliver a lecture and lead a discussion on Plato in his own voice, the 7th letter versus the dialogues. And Jan Watson will be putting the links, looks like she already is, the links to these events to register ahead of time in the chat box. Also, next month, the next First Friday lecture will happen on March 5, and the speaker will be basic program instructor Keith Cleveland. Keith's title will be, get ready for this, On the Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. It's going to, so why does math work? It's going to be deep. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School Community website in a day or 2 or 3. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Clare Pearson joined the basic program staff in 1997 after 10 years of undergraduate teaching at the University of Chicago and the Honors College at Valparaiso University. She did her undergraduate work as well as graduate work with the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, where she worked on the intersections of literature and philosophy, with special attention to the interrelationship of literature and ethics. From 2004 to 2008, Clare chaired the basic program and co-designed the Asian Classics program, which she also chaired from 2006 to early 2009. She is the 2008 recipient of the Graham School Excellence in Teaching Award for the basic program. And in addition to her classes in BP, she currently teaches in the Humanities and Philosophy Department at Oakton Community College. And without further ado, I present to you Clare Pearson.
Thank you, Kendall, and good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to sort of see you here. This is my first experience of a Zoom lecture. And as I told Kendall yesterday when we went through practice stuff, I'm a Luddite. And so I know that most people have, when they've given these lectures, done slideshows with visuals. And so I will apologize to you for my Luddite status. This is going to be given the way I would give an ordinary lecture in person. So you're stuck with, you don't have to look at my face, but you're stuck with my words, I'm afraid, and no fun visuals there. I am excited to get a chance to do this topic. And so this is something I've been thinking about for a lot of years. And so without further ado, let's jump into the talk itself. I've been spending much of the last 2 months immersed in Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is one of, I think, the greatest novels ever written. And so out of that immersion, let me sketch out to you where I am with this at this point. In 1856, during the period of American history marked by the Fugitive Slave Act, 7 years before the Emancipation Proclamation and 9 years before the end of the Civil War, Margaret Garner, a 22-year-old woman who was a slave on a Kentucky plantation, escaped with her 4 young children across the Ohio River to the free city of Cincinnati, the first stop on the Underground Railway in a journey that was intended to take her to Canada. Only 2 hours later, she was found and arrested under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act. When she was caught, she was found in a back room where she had already slit the throat of her 2-year-old daughter with a butcher's knife. The other children were found with her, wounded but alive. After a 2-week trial where John Joliffe, an abolitionist lawyer, argued that she and her children should be considered free, the judge ruled against her, and she was ordered to be returned to slavery with her remaining children and was handed back to the plantation owner. She was put on a ship where, in a storm, she and one of her remaining children were washed overboard, or perhaps jumped overboard. It's not entirely clear. And while she was recovered and rescued, the second child was drowned. It is not clear what hand she might have had in that drowning, but she insisted that it is better for the child to have died than to live and be returned to slavery. Back in Cincinnati, Joliffe was still fighting for her, and then convinced the judge to arrest her and try her on murder charges with the idea that that at least would free her. But Gaines, the plantation owner, had managed to hide her and ultimately sold her to his brother in Arkansas so that she couldn't be found to be arrested and returned to Cincinnati. She died 2 years later of typhoid, still a slave. Toni Morrison ran across the original newspaper account of Margaret Garner in a Cincinnati archive and decided to make the core of this story a slave woman's choice to murder her small children rather than see them captured and returned to slavery into her book, Beloved. Margaret Garner became Sethe, who is arrested for murder and spends several years in jail, while neither she nor her children are returned to slavery. And the book begins nearly 20 years later, where Sethe lives alone with her remaining daughter in a house haunted by a ghost who is both the murdered baby and something more than the murdered baby. In writing the brief background story of the real Margaret Garner, I found myself unconsciously slipping into present tense. I had to go back multiple times to correct the slips and to impose a past tense on the events. By the way, I didn't catch them all. I had to correct it again as I was reading it. After all, this is history, and history is supposed to be in the past, over and done with, isn't it? It's part of the brilliance of Morrison's novel and of her choice to shape this story as a story of a haunting, that it throws us in the much more complicated truth of how we as human beings experience time and history, our personal history, our cultural history, our national history, none of which are ever simply over and in the past. How do we live a human life in the constant presence of the past, especially of a past that is traumatic, of events and our own responses to them that themselves violate and deny the possibility of living a human life, which somehow has to be lived anyway? This is undeniably a painful novel to read for all readers, I think. A difficult novel, not because it is hard to comprehend, but because the story takes us to places that show us what we would rather not see, that asked us to experience what we would rather not experience. But Morrison has managed to tell Sethe's story and the connected stories of those around her in a way that is at the same time poetic, beautiful, and mesmerizing, so that the power of her language immerses us and holds us there. And the pain of the events is elevated at the same time with a beauty that does not allow us to look away. I originally sketched out this lecture several years ago, and I was prevented from giving it by an unfortunate combination of events. Coming back to it at this point in time, after the year we have experienced collectively as Americans in 2020, I found that it was impossible to speak about this book in the same way, that there are elements of the book that pushed themselves to the fore and claim to need to be addressed at this particular moment. With that in mind, I want to approach this topic in three parts, beginning with a short discussion of Morrison's own commentary on what she intended in this book and how we should and shouldn't approach it as readers if we are to be able to hear its story and grasp it on its intended terms. After that, I will briefly explore the central haunting of the novel and what that haunting means in terms of the experience of the characters. Finally, I'll touch on a part of the story that is offered in the novel, that shows itself as something that needs to be explored, but that is not and cannot be in any way resolved in the novel. And that is the way in which this story has a continuing impact, not just on those who experience slavery personally or through their families, and not just on the African-American community, but on American history and culture as a whole, and in a specific way on the culture of white America. Morrison's novel is ultimately a novel of healing, and it shows us how the characters confront their personal traumatic history in an attempt to heal it from it, and how the community coming together confronts its own need for healing from this history. Implicit in this, but necessarily left undone, is the need for some parallel but different form of action and healing on the other side by those who were implicated in slavery and still are culturally. So the first part. In her 1993 Nobel lecture, Morrison retells a myth in her version, a story in which an old blind woman, a daughter of slaves, is asked an impossible question by children who seem to be coming to challenge and test her, to challenge her authority and to devalue her in the process. Morrison takes us inside the mind of the wise old woman as she explores what language is as a living power versus as a dead language, and what power storytelling in particular has in human life. Political language, including academic language, or what she calls statist language, is censored and censoring. Ruthless in its policing duties, it has no desire or purpose other than maintaining its own exclusivity and dominance. Unreceptive to interrogation, it cannot form or tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts, tell another story, fill baffling silences. She tells us that the old woman is keenly aware that no intellectual mercenary nor insatiable dictator, no paid-for politician or demagogue, no counterfeit journalist would be persuaded by her thoughts. There is and will be rousing language to keep citizens armed and arming, slaughtered and slaughtering in the malls, courthouses, post offices, playgrounds, bedrooms, and boulevards. Stirring memorializing language to mask the pity and waste of needless death. In opposition to this, she revisits the scriptural story of the Tower of Babel. The conventional wisdom of the Tower of Babel story is that the collapse was a misfortune, that it was the distraction or the weight of many languages that precipitated the tower's failed architecture, that one monolithic language would have expedited the building and heaven would have been reached. Whose heaven, she wonders, and what kind? Perhaps the achievement of paradise was premature, a little hasty if no one could take the time to understand other languages, other views, other narratives, period. Had they, the heaven they imagined might have been found at their feet. Complicated and demanding, yes, but a view of heaven as life, not heaven as post-life. With this appeal, Morrison presents to us the power of language as something which is always at its heart a matter of the power to tell one's own story and to hear the story and life of an other, and rests in the claim that our humanity can only be developed when we take up the challenge of listening to and struggling to really understand the stories and language of the many others with whom we share this world. And we can only really understand ourselves through the ability to open ourselves to the stories and struggles of others. These others are not just others in the sense they are not us. They are others who are fundamentally unlike us, who see and experience the world differently. There's an interpretation of the Garden of Eden story in Genesis, which I have always personally found compelling, though it is certainly not the most traditional interpretation. That God, after creating Adam and finding that there was among the animals no helper suitable to him, creates woman not to be a companion or a wife or a mother, but to be a mirror to him who is at the same time both equal and different, to reflect humanity back to him in the gap, in the difference, so that he can come into his own and become a free person who can then be said to be in the image of God. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who was also a scholar grounded in Talmudic studies and who wrote Talmudic studies, argues similarly to Morrison that our first experience of the world is an experience of self, that we discover that our minds can reduce the world to our own form, take power over the world and manipulate it, but that we only fundamentally experience our own humanity when we look into the face of another human being and realize that that human being can never be universalized, reduced to a version of us without violating them. That the human being in their unbridgeable difference obligates us to see them, to acknowledge and respect them, to respond to them in their terms, and with that, to begin to live in a world that is larger than us, exceeds our capacity to understand and control it, but for the first time becomes ethical and makes us fully human. Letting go of control, letting go of power, including the reductive power of rational constructs, allows us to become and be more than we are. Morrison emphasizes that the heart of language is nuanced, complex midwifery, and that the telling of and listening to stories is fundamental to this ethical call to our own humanity. She says that narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. For our sake and yours, forget the name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and in the light. Don't tell us what you believe, what to fear. Show us belief's wide skirt and the stitch that unravels fear's call. You, old woman blessed with blindness, can speak the language that tells us what only language can, how to see without pictures. Language alone protects us from the scariness of things with no names. Language alone is meditation. It is in this sense that we should hear Morrison's earlier comments about her intentions in writing Beloved itself. She said earlier in her career that Black writers needed to free themselves from what she calls the white gaze. That in particular, Black writers needed to resist the public demand for literary self-flagellation, which she describes as publishers and editors looking for Black writers to, quote, tell me how angry you are, and describe the horrors of their victimhood. Morrison argues that the demands for this kind of writing is just feeding the vampire, that it occurs at the expense of the power of stories to describe a complicated, extraordinary survival life, instead replacing that with stories that are focused on educating white people and that play into the yearning of the expressions of guilt by white people. The challenge instead is to claim one's own voice and agency, to tell one's own story, and to allow that story to be and describe healing and survival for itself and on its own terms. In writing the stories of African Americans, you can't avoid and ignore the experience of slavery, but you can't just make slavery itself the story. Morrison early on, in an interview shortly after the publication of Beloved, says, my disappointment in some of the accounts of slavery were based on the fact that this is so large. You can let slavery be the plot, but then the center of it becomes the institution, not the people. So the focus on the experience of the characters and their interior life is like putting the authority back into the hands of the slave and not the slaveholder. When the institution comes to the center, the language of institutions dominates. The power of the story to speak dies. It is co-opted into a language of control. When the story itself, in the voice of the person, comes to the center, then it can speak as story. And it can also be a claiming, a retaking of agency. Morrison adds, I wanted her past, Sethe's past, her haunting memories not to be abstract. I wanted her to sit down at the table with things she has been trying to avoid and explain away, the terrible things that happened to her, trying not to confront it, as a way of saying that's what the past is. It's a living thing, a relationship between ourselves and our personal history, our racial history, and our national history. In this, she argues, she writes as an African-American woman about a particular woman's experience and writes for African-American people as an act of reclaiming agency personally and for African-American people. But at the same time, she emphasizes that she hopes that everyone will read, echoing the demand of the children in her Nobel lecture. Tell us what it is to be a woman so that we may know what it is to be a man, what moves at the margin, what it is to have no home in this place, to be set adrift from the one you knew, what it is to live at the edge of towns that cannot bear your company. And in doing this, she argues, she's not interested in evil. Evil is too interesting, too easy. Goodness is really, truly hard. You can't seduce it. Writing and trying to find language for goodness is all I have ever felt in the novel. Morrison's words need to guide us as we read this novel, as we understand this novel. Without question, she, like the old woman, is aware that not only does the story have to be told, but that it may fall on deaf ears. There has to be a willingness to hear, to listen, to attempt to understand, for the story to really do its full work. Even within the story itself, the story functions through storytelling. We don't get Sethe's story from the beginning. We get it in bits and pieces as it circles around the main point in a way that Sethe herself, at the end of the first part of the novel, finds herself circling the room as she tries to tell Paul D what he wants to know, and circling the story at the same time because it is fundamentally untellable. The story emerges through the process of thinking, telling, remembering. And that process is a constant struggle with the fight not to remember, with the desire not to hear, not to re-experience, not to hear and re-experience one's own past, not to remember it, not to hear the pain and trauma of other people's stories, out of fear that one cannot handle it, cannot face the truth that it entails. The structure of Beloved is that of a ghost story, of a haunting. And the ghost is the ghost of a traumatic past. This haunting, the recurrence of this past, is framed as a continual intrusive reemergence of the past in a way that disrupts the present and attempts to deny the possibility of any future. I'm far from the first person to notice that the haunting conveys very accurately the psychological experience of trauma with much depth and nuance. There's a lot that has been written on this subject. It can fill books, and it has filled books. And I can't attempt to replace that here or to rehearse all of it here. I do want to point out some bits of it, and also to suggest that it's important not simply to psychologize the story. This is a deep psychological story of a confrontation with history and with personal trauma and the trauma of a people. The ghosts, however, can't simply be reduced to something inside Sethe's head. Her experience of this transcends a merely personal experience of it. When Sethe is having a conversation with Denver, the daughter who is the only daughter born into freedom and the daughter who she still lives with, she says something which is, this is a powerful passage of the novel, and it remains something that has to be confronted on multiple levels. She says to Denver, who asks when she sees her in a certain position, "Were you praying?" No, I was not praying. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do. But it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the place, the picture of it, stays. And not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around out there outside my head. I mean, even if I didn't know it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Asked Denver. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'll be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on, so clear, and you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a rememory that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who was never there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there waiting for you. So Denver, you can't never go there. Never. Because even though it's all over and done with, it's always going to be there waiting for you. It has been commented on many times the way in which Morrison co-opts African folk beliefs, African American folk beliefs about time, about haunting, ghosts, and the afterlife, and the persistence of ghosts and spirits in the world in her stories. I want to suggest here that this isn't just a casual novelist's relying on certain story elements that belong to African culture, but there is another side to this real persistence of events in time outside of the minds and memories and lives of the people directly to whom they happened. This part of what Sethe tells us about rememory and how events have a life of their own apart from the people to whom they happened and the time in which they happened, is part of a critical reflection, I think, on the power of the past to continue to influence and repeat itself in the larger culture until it is, or at least until it is, confronted, processed, healed, and dealt with in a full way by the entire culture. One of the things that we see in the novel is not only Sethe's attempt to confront her own story, her own actions, and her own experiences, and find a way to live with that past. But in Denver, who is the hero of this story, we face the way in which that past, supposedly over and done with, persists and repeats itself in echoes through time that continue to impact anyone who comes into the radius of its effect. And I think that's something that we're meant to take very seriously here. I want to return, first of all, though, to the way, the overview of the structure of the novel and the role that time and memory, or the better word, rememory, has in shaping this structure and in shaping this as the story of a haunting. In the first part of the novel, the past is presented as something intrusive and unwanted, although at the same time not entirely unwanted, impossible to simply let go of. Soon after we first meet Sethe, we're presented with a discussion of memory. We are in her mind, and she remembers telling baby Suggs, her mother-in-law, that baby doesn't remember anything about her children because she won't let herself remember. And then telling this story quickly evokes an actual experience of the intrusiveness that unwanted memories have. Sethe thinks about how, running through the field to rinse the chamomile sap off her legs, the past is at first absent. The picture of the men coming to nurse her was as lifeless as the nerves in her back where the skin buckled like a washboard. Nor was there the faintest scent of ink or the cherry gum and oak bark from which it was made. Nothing. But with simple everyday sounds and events, the past emerges unwanted despite itself. And despite Sethe, suddenly there was Sweet Home rolling out before the eyes. And although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not want to make her scream, it rolled out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone, all right, but hidden in lacy groves. Boys hanging from the most beautiful sycamores in the world. It shamed her, remembering the wonderful soughing trees and not the boys. Try as she might, the sycamores beat out the children every time, and she could not forgive her memory for that. The past takes over unbidden and without warning, but it comes in forms that push away and hide the trauma and the danger under seductive surfaces. Sethe has been isolated for nearly 20 years at this time, after she has tried to save her children by killing them, succeeding in killing her 2-year-old daughter, after she has spent time in jail with her youngest, after she returns from jail to find that the community has abandoned her, is horrified at her, and leaves her alone to deal with her own trauma and her own healing. When Paul D arrives, breaking for the first time Sethe's isolation, together they indulge in the less threatening of these memories, beginning to open up a past that skates away from the troubling pain, and only gradually, circling around it, begins to touch on the core of this. This is done delicately, each of them aware that the other one might not want to know it, might not want to hear it, and aware that revisiting the past gives it a power beyond the power it already has to disrupt the present and to some degree block the future. It gives it the power to swallow them up entirely and to prevent them from being able to face life at all, which is what has eventually happened to baby Suggs when she takes to her bed and waits to die. As Paul D begins to open up his own story to Sethe, he stops, aware of how it could affect them both. Paul D had only begun. What he was telling her was only the beginning, when her fingers on his knee, soft and reassuring, stopped him. Just as well, just as well. Saying more might push them both to a place they couldn't get back from. He would keep the rest where it belonged, in that tobacco tin buried in his chest where a red heart used to be, its lid rusted shut. He would not pry it loose now in front of this sweet, sturdy woman, for if she got a whiff on the contents, it would shame him. And it would certainly hurt her to know that there was no red heart bright as Mister's comb beating in him. In the second part of the story, the first part of the story builds to the gradual revelation of the tragic event where Sethe, to save her children from slavery, kills her daughter and tries to kill the others. Hearing this event drives Paul D from the house. And in the second part, after Paul D abandons the house, they are re-immersed in isolation. And in this renewed and deepened isolation, the ghost begins to achieve full possession, eating up Sethe and also indirectly Denver. The ghost, who was at first a spiritual presence, spiteful, mischievous, sticking its hands in the cake, shaking up the house in various ways, becomes embodied, becomes a physical person, becomes the image of the young woman beloved, who not accidentally is nameless, except for the name that is carved on the tombstone of the murdered daughter. Only after Paul D arrives, and only after his arrival, begins to create the possibility of abandoning the past and moving forward into some kind of future. When Paul D leaves the house, Sethe actively returns in her memory to Baby Suggs' preaching, to Baby Suggs' exhortation to lay it all down, sword and shield, lay it all down. But her attempt to lay it all down here is an abandonment to the past that wants to devour her. She lays down her life itself in an attempt to find a way to justify, to confront, to make sense of what she has done in killing her daughter, out of love for her daughter, to save her daughter. The ghost, no longer a ghost, the physical presence of beloved in the house, works on Sethe and on everyone around her in a way that draws from them their stories. Beloved draws from Denver's stories about Sethe, and particularly her favorite one, the story of her own birth, which she has to retell over and over again to feed Beloved's insatiable hunger. From Sethe, and with respect to Sethe, the issue becomes very complex. Sethe welcomes being taken over by what she comes to understand as the ghost of her daughter. Her daughter has come back to her, And because her daughter has come back to her, she doesn't need to explain anymore. She believes that she is forgiven. There's no need to try to justify herself for anybody. There is no longer the damning judgment of the world to face and of her own conscience to face. There is no need to defend how she could murder a child in an attempt to keep her safe. She could destroy her daughter to protect her daughter. The paradox of the whole thing is still before her, though. She keeps saying repeatedly in the second part of the novel, I don't have to explain to you. I don't have to tell you. And you don't have to listen to it if you don't want. And then she compulsively tells and retells the story in a way that wrestles with trying to justify and pleads for the forgiveness that she keeps telling herself she already has. The story is a story that Sethe herself cannot speak to anybody else. She tries to tell Paul D. She's only able to try to tell him because he offers her a non-judgmental love. But she fails to tell him. She cannot get the story out. She circles around it at the end of part one in that room, trying to explain, and she ends up stopping and realizing that there is no way to explain it to somebody who doesn't immediately understand it. Either you get this or you don't get it. And if you don't get it, words can't do anything. And so instead of telling her story, telling what her experience is to Paul D, she simply asserts, I kept her safe. I did it. I kept my children. I stopped him. I kept her safe. And Paul D, not surprisingly, is shaken by the assertion that you can find safety in a handsaw. You can keep a child safe by destroying that child's life. This, of course, picks up on a larger theme that shapes the novel as a whole, which is safety and the impossibility of safety in the face of the world that has been shaped by this trauma. But Sethe needs to tell that story because it's only in telling the story that she can come to grips with herself. She creates herself in the telling of herself, and the story, in a certain sense, has to be told. And she can only tell that story if she believes she can tell it without judgment. So she can only tell that story to the ghost. But in telling the story to the ghost, she's avoiding herself and avoiding the story at the same time. The embodiment that the ghost represents is, in a certain sense, a denial of what her act has done. Her baby girl isn't really dead. She's here, alive before her. She has come back. Her action is annihilated in the ghost who has taken form and who draws the story out of her. And in annihilating that action, she can get caught up in the need to justify herself, in the need to reclaim herself from an act that basically destroyed her own humanity rather than allowing it to be further destroyed by slavery, and destroyed the very existence of her child rather than allow that to be violated by school teacher. She says at one point, "I had to kill you. If I didn't kill you, you would have died." And Sethe, in the second part of this novel, remains trapped in the paradox of that. She is slowly devoured by the ghost. She shrinks away to nothingness. She loses every hold on every grip, not only of a future, but of the present. She starves herself and becomes frail and exhausted, while the ghost grows and becomes more alive and more full-bodied until the ghost herself, is finally the image of a beautiful, healthy, and fully pregnant woman there feeding on the life of the house. Sethe cannot exorcise this ghost. The only person who can do anything about it is, first of all, Denver. Denver has been trapped in the past and in a kind of perpetual dance between past and present, as much as her mother has. She has lived in the house, afraid to go outside. Her one venture outside confronts her with a young boy who asks her a question that causes traumatic deafness, asks her, is it true what her mother did, that she was in prison for murdering her daughter, trying to kill her children, that you were there with her? And Denver, rather than hearing the answer, shuts down her ability to perceive and bonds with the ghost and remains in the house, terrified of being devoured by the memories, the rememories that inhabit the outside world and can destroy her without warning if she stumbles across them. She's finally moved to break away from the enmeshment and the possession that happens in part 2 by recognizing that Sethe is not going to survive this, and by claiming her loyalty to her mother, by claiming her mother for herself, and then being empowered to gradually reclaim herself and her own agency in an attempt to venture outside the house and to make contact with the outside world, with the community, to reach out for help. In the last part of the novel, which is the shortest part, the ghost is exorcised from the house against Sethe's will. She is exorcised, though not completely, from the world. She remains out of the house, not in physical form, an inhabitant of the clearing in the woods, there in the footsteps that she leaves for any who want to see them and step into them, but not in a way that aggressively takes over. Gone but not gone, relegated to the proper space for the past, but not simply overcome or abandoned, kept at a respectable distance. The third part of the novel requires the community to come together through Denver's intervention and then the intervention of Lady Jones, and gradually the voice of Ella, to recognize this haunting as something, as coming from a past that they have all shared in a version of. They all have their own hauntings. They all have their own ghosts. And as Ella says, she doesn't have any problem with the ghosts as long as they keep to the spirit world and keep at bay on the edges of life. But to step into the physical world, to sit at the dining table, to challenge them directly, can't be allowed. It could happen to any of them. And Ella, in this case, is thinking about her own past. She has one of the most traumatic versions of a past of any of the people who are discussed in the novel, in that she is kept prisoner. She is kept as a sex slave by a white man and his son, and abused for years. And her response to this abuse is to reject the very idea of loving anybody, to stand on her own feet apart from love, to not believe in it, to not trust it. And yet, to claim her position there. One of the things that threatens to emerge from the past and overwhelm her, as Sethe is overwhelmed, is that she gave birth to a child, a white hairy thing, the child of rape, and refuses to nurse it and allows it to die. And that is there, and it is something that she lives with at a distance. But the idea that that could come and take her over and claim her is a call to her and to everybody in the community to own the past and the haunting that Sethe is facing. And they come together, and through their voices, exorcise the ghost in a way that produces for Sethe a physical re-experience of the tragic event, in that Sethe, hearing the voices outside, comes from having, with an ice pick in her hand, from having been chopping ice, to the doorway, where what she sees is Godwin, the owner of the house, an important abolitionist, a kind man, coming up to the house to pick up Denver for her new job. But what she experiences is a repetition of School Teacher and the Slave Catchers, the four horsemen, coming to her house the day she rushes to the shed, the cold room, with her children and tries to kill them. This time, she takes the ice pick and rushes at Godwin and tries to kill him. But she's stopped by Denver, most of all, by Denver. And the exorcism of the ghost succeeds in getting rid of the flesh and blood living figure of beloved. But it leaves Sethe in Baby Suggs's bed with no future, with no present, with an inability to confront her own suffering and her own action, just as Baby Suggs was. Baby Suggs could neither condemn nor condone Sethe's act. So she takes to her bed, contemplates color, and waits for death. Sethe has not successfully been able to confront her own action here. And while the ghost is expelled through the coming together again of the community around her, she still takes to her bed. And it is only Paul D's outreach to her, when Paul D can forgive her, can understand what is incomprehensible, can come back to her in an unjudging way and say to her, we have too much past, what we need is a future, and offer her a future. Only then can she, in a certain way, in any meaningful way, begin to live a human life again in a way that acknowledges but isn't devoured by the past. We end the story with, it was not a story to pass on, the repeated, echoed lines, it was not a story to pass on. This past needs to be healed and to be exorcised, even though this can never be complete. It needs to have its intrusions and the continuing damage that it does, and the threats that inform it, and the threats that accompany it at every step. Put down, laid down, allowed to be passed, which is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. In the story, which Morrison tells us is a story of healing, we see the confrontation with that attempt to lay it all down. And we see a kind of successful healing that is not just Sethe's healing, it is Denver's healing, it is Paul D's healing, and it is a healing that extends into the community. Incomplete, a step in the right direction toward claiming agency, embracing a future, taking one's own life upon oneself. But unfinished. The ghost remains there in the past and can be awakened at any time. What is Sethe's issue here? Is this issue, which has to be banished, the general wounding done by slavery altogether? In a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. Sethe's reaction to Slavekeeper coming is what is, on the one hand, as she puts it herself, as she's telling it to Beloved, it's an experience of hummingbirds with needle beaks piercing her skull and thinking, no, 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 and flying unthinkingly to stop school teacher, to stop the apocalypse of the four horsemen in the only way she knows how to stop it, which is to stop life itself, because there is no safety to be had. But as Ella says, it is not her rage and not her fear that she takes issue with, not even the killing of her daughter, the attempted killing of her children. It is the fact that she stands by what she did and claims that she had to do it, that it was right, that it was the only option open to her, that Ella cannot handle, that Paul D rejects, that drive the community away from her. Sethe has in her some of the qualities that we see in Sixo, who is one of the most wonderful characters in the novel, although a minor one. Sixo, the only one of the Sweet Home men who remembers his native land, and so remembers what it is like to be free, to claim his own humanity, and to have a self and a culture. Sixo, who stops speaking English because there is no future in it, understands the world, both the world of slavery and, more importantly, the world that exists beyond it. He's smart, self-possessed, and he is always defiant. In the end, school teacher has to realize that he can't beat him or tame him. He can only kill him. And when he tries to torture him by burning him alive, he ends up having to shoot him because Sixo laughs gleefully in his face as the flames engulf him. His heroic humanity defeats all school teachers' attempts to reduce him to nothing. Augustina Zuriga of the University of Ghana says that as an African man and warrior, Sixo would be expected to display endurance and courage in the face of extreme torture and death. This is the ultimate test of African manhood, and his attitude frightens his white captors, who, as Morrison tells us through Paul D's thoughts and memories, are men who knew their manhood lay in their guns and were not even embarrassed that without gunshot, Fox would laugh at them. This takes us to the other side of the story. Traumatic wounds are by definition wounds that are inflicted through damages to and corruption from violated and violating relationships. I can't ever encounter trauma by myself. Mere injury, no matter how painful or disabling, is never traumatic. Pain, difficulty, and loss are part of every life, a part of being human, and not an assault on that humanity itself. Worst, if I lose my eyesight or lose the use of my legs, I may have to face how that will impact what I have come to count on as myself and my ways of getting around the world and presenting myself to others, my ability to do work I see as essential, and that's not to be minimized, but it's also not the same as trauma. Trauma involves being subjected to some kind of serious betrayal, some kind of assault on one's humanity itself, assault on the structure of our ability to trust and defend from ourselves from and to be respected by other people. Rape, torture, physical and emotional abuses all entail emotional violations of our humanity. They all deny that the victim is worthy of the basic respect that any human being should be able to count on from any other human being. They dehumanize the person and turn them into an object to be used or treated as trash and violated at will. And they do this in a particular way by destroying the capacity for relationship. Slavery is a particularly extreme example of that kind of traumatic violation, and Morrison shows it to us over and over again, not just because of the explicit dehumanization of people that we run up against in the experiences of the individuals, but from the refusal to grant slaves the ability to have personal relationships, to be parents, to be siblings, to be husband or wife, to have a family and a community that they can love and be attached to and hold on to. Human beings under slavery are subhuman individual creatures who are bought and sold without any regard to the idea that they are enmeshed as human beings in families and in communities. One of the things that the nature of trauma means is that trauma is always double-sided. For every victim of trauma, there is an offender. There is someone who has chosen to traumatize another. For every cultural institution that victimizes classes of people, there is a flip side of that institution that sets up other people to enact that traumatization, to victimize others. It's not possible for there to be cultural and institutional victimization without there being also a culture and institutions that promote victimizing. And as cultural, embedded in the very structure and ideas and relationships that hold society together, this does not have to be intentional, conscious, or chosen by any particular member. It's not only part of the unconscious, it is enforced and reinforced in invisible ways by structures that are larger than individuals and that hold them and constrain them. We encounter this within the novel with the constant wrestling with the issue of white people. Baby Suggs at one point in her collapse gives up and says there is no evil but white people. At the same time, we watch Sethe and others, including Paul D., wrestle with the idea that not all white people are bad. The Garners treated them with respect. They were so-called good slave owners. They practiced a different kind of slavery. They listened to them. They called them human beings. They took them seriously and believed that their experiences were valuable and their words were meaningful. And yet, as Paul D. confronts, they were only men so long as they were on Sweet Home. And when Garner dies and school teacher comes, he's faced with the fact that his manhood is a fragile thing that, because of the system, relies on the granting of manhood to him by one individual, and that can't be sustained in the larger world. Sethe wrestles with the goodness of the Garners, with the goodness of Bodwin, the abolitionist, the Bodwin siblings. And she too tries to defend them. And ultimately, one of the things that the novel so brilliantly does is, without ever being accusatory, without ever being condemning or damning or passing judgment, shows us the hundreds of tiny ways in which even the well-intentioned, genuinely well-meaning white people get trapped in the continuing dehumanization of African Americans without believing in it, without wanting to do it. This is an issue which has to be, which the novel invites white readers to confront without imposing on it. Morrison argues that African Americans can only, any victim of trauma can only heal themselves, and the African American community can only claim its own agency and heal itself. But as long as the trauma of slavery persists in the larger American world, in white culture, those events are still sitting out there, waiting to be stumbled into, threatening to recur in echoes that re-traumatize people again and again. And white people themselves are not undamaged by this. She says that white people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle. Swiftly unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. In a way, they were right, but it wasn't the jungle black folks brought with them to this place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them, and it grew, it spread, until it invaded the whites who had made them bloody, silly, worse even than they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. The novel leaves us with an invitation to confront this. And this is something that cannot be confronted in the story of an African-American woman written in and for and by an African-American. It's an invitation for the listener, for the hearer who is willing to experience the story of someone who is other, to be enlarged by that in a way that holds the mirror to them and turns them inward, that enables them to confront in a Jungian way the way they have run away from their own shadow and otherized it and externalized it, and so become dehumanized themselves. I am reminded of George Orwell's wonderful story, Shooting an Elephant, and this is an appropriate move to make because this is the story of a white man serving in the military, in the British Raj, as an agent of an oppressive system that he does not buy into, and telling us about his experience of how this system dehumanizes and reduces and threatens to destroy him, so that we can hear that story and confront it for ourselves. And I want to read a little passage from the Orwell story. In Moulmein in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in my life I have ever been important enough for this to happen to me. I was subdivisional police officer of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit Beetlejuice all over her dress. As a police officer, I was an obvious target and was baited whenever it seemed safe to do so. All this was perplexing and upsetting, for at the time I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked up my job and got out of it, the better. Theoretically, and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters. The wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the gray-cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who had been bogged with the bamboos, all these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down in secula seculorum upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a priest's guts. Feelings like these are the normal byproducts of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you can catch him off duty. He comes at the end of this story, after exploring this, to the story of actually shooting an elephant that he does not want to shoot. And in reflecting on this, on having killed this elephant, on having badly killed this elephant in a way that tortures this poor beast, he says, "It was at this moment, as I stood there with the rifle in my hands, that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life in trying to impress the natives. And so in every crisis, he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it." Orwell's reflections, I think, echo Morrison's analysis of the other cultural component, the way in which white culture, caught in a dialectic of domination, dehumanizes white people themselves, and even dehumanizes unconsciously, unintentionally, through the system itself, people who are unwilling participants and would not buy into that which they end up perpetuating. I think the book, especially at this point in time, calls us to not only experience the voice of Sethe and the voice of the experience of slavery, but to face ourselves in our own relationship to the continuation of that experience. Thank you.
Oh, and I will see if I can unmute everyone. Okay, everyone, unmute yourselves. And, oh, wait. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourselves now to applaud. Claire, thank you very much. There we go. And now Claire's muted. Our cups are filled over the brim with wisdom. So we don't have any time for questions.
I'm so sorry for going on so long. I was trying to keep it short, but it's a big book.
and it was to our benefit, but I have them harvested. So those of you who ask questions and the numerous people who sent messages of praise to the chat function, rest assured that I will email them to Claire within, say, by 1:45 today. So thank you very much. And everybody have a great weekend. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Claire.
Sorry for not allowing time for questions. I didn't mean to do that.
It happens.